Hey everyone, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into the world of business ecosystems.
A topic I know can feel a bit like a buzzword salad some days.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's throwing it around. But are we just talking about glorified partnerships here? What makes an ecosystem different? We've got this hefty book literally titled Business Ecosystems from 2022. So clearly the idea is not brand new.
It's true, the term's been around, but there's a reason it's having a moment.
So walk me and our listener through it.
It's about moving away from that traditional company-centric view. Think of it less like building a single company and more like cultivating a garden. You've got different players, each with their own strengths, coming together to achieve something none of them can pull off solo.
Okay, I'm already digging the garden analogy. But isn't every business a collaboration in some way? Like my local coffee shop relies on bean suppliers, baristas, the whole deal.
You're right, collaboration's always been there. The difference with the systems is the level of interdependence and something called modularity. And that's where it gets really interesting.
Hit me with it. What's modularity in this context? Break it down for us.
Imagine those building blocks you played with as a kid. Each block is independent, but you can snap them together in tons of ways to create different structures. In a business ecosystem, each player is like a block, offering a specific capability or resource. They can plug and play into different ecosystems depending on the goal.
Okay, so it's about flexibility and specialized roles. But this book, while insightful, doesn't sugarcoat things. It dives into some major ecosystem myths, which feels like a good place to start. What's myth number one?
Myth number one is that every business needs an ecosystem to thrive. And that's just not true. The book uses the example of EssilorLuxottica, the eyewear giant. They control most of their supply chain, very vertically integrated, and they're incredibly successful.
So if I'm hearing you right, and you're saying if I'm in a stable, well-established industry, maybe an ecosystem isn't mission critical. But what if I'm in, say, a rapidly evolving space like renewable energy?
You're spot on. The book suggests that ecosystems are especially potent in unpredictable environments or when you're exploring the unknown. Like, think about autonomous vehicles. You've got tech companies, car manufacturers, even regulators all trying to figure it out. That's ripe for an ecosystem approach.
Makes total sense. So not everyone needs an ecosystem. But if you're in one of those dynamic fields, it might give you an edge. Now, I know this book goes deep on why ecosystems fail, and frankly, some of the reasons are surprisingly basic.
One major pitfall is tackling a problem that's just not significant enough to justify the investment and complexity of an ecosystem.
You're saying it has to be a problem worth solving, right?
Yeah.
Not just any old challenge.
Exactly. They use the example of Google trying to crack the social media code with Google and Orkut.
Oh, yeah, those didn't exactly set the world on fire, did they? Which is kind of wild, considering it's Google we're talking about.
Right. Despite their massive reach and some initial growth, these platforms ultimately fizzled because they didn't solve a big enough problem for users. They didn't offer enough value to keep people engaged, even with Google's resources behind them.
It's a good reminder that even giants stumble. Okay, so significant problem check. What other hallmarks define ecosystems that actually work? How do they function in the real world?
This book breaks them down into two main types: transaction ecosystems and solution ecosystems. Think ride-sharing apps like Uber as a transaction model. They connect riders and drivers and facilitate a transaction pretty straightforward.
Crystal clear. Now, what about the solution type? Give us a scenario there.
Imagine a smart home system. You've got devices, appliances, maybe even your lighting, all talking to each other, working together to create this seamless experience for you. That's a solution ecosystem, creating a complete package rather than just facilitating a single transaction.
Ah, so it's about orchestrating a whole experience. Now, whether it's transactions or solutions, this book keeps coming back to the importance of a solid governance model. Help us understand what that even means in an ecosystem context. It seems kind of crucial.
It is, and it's where things get really interesting. Think about Apple and Sony. Sony had an e-reader even before the Kindle. And technologically, it was amazing, sleek design, the whole 9 yards. But publishers didn't trust Sony's open system with their valuable content.
Too much risk of piracy or losing control of their product. So even with a great device, Sony shot themselves in the foot.
Exactly. Amazon came in with the Kindle, which maybe wasn't as flashy at the time, but they created a closed, controlled ecosystem, one that publishers felt good about. And, well, you know who won that battle?
Wow, so bad governance can literally kill your business, even with a superior product. That's a harsh lesson. It's clear that trust is a major factor. What other elements contribute to good governance in an ecosystem?
Transparency is huge. The book talks about companies like Dassault Systems, the software company, and how they openly share their product roadmap. This builds confidence and encourages others to buy in. Of course there are other approaches.
You're saying there's no one size fits all.
Right. You've got companies like Apple who are notoriously secretive, but it works for them. It's a different approach to building trust. It comes down to finding the right fit for your specific ecosystem.
Okay, so different strokes, different folks, but transparency seems to be a recurring theme. And speaking of trust, we can't talk about ecosystems without addressing data. It's a lifeblood of so many businesses these days. So how does data play into this whole ecosystem equation?
Data is absolutely crucial, especially when you think about that trust factor we were just talking about. The book actually dedicates a whole section to data ecosystems.
Data ecosystems. Okay, now you're really speaking my language.
They're especially relevant in healthcare. Imagine a world where your medical records are securely shared between your doctor, your specialist, even researchers, all to personalize your treatment and advance medical knowledge as a whole.
That sounds incredible, like personalized medicine, faster breakthroughs, but also a tad bit creepy, right? What could possibly go wrong? I mean, we've all seen those data breach headlines.
You're hitting on a crucial point. It all comes down to those factors we keep circling back to: trust, transparency, and ethical data usage. Without those, data ecosystems can quickly go from a force for good to a whole lot of trouble.
Totally. We've seen that play out with data privacy concerns in other areas of tech. Okay, so data is obviously a big piece of this puzzle. Now, I've talked about the companies that orchestrate these ecosystems, the ones calling the shots. But what about the other players, the contributors? What are their strategies for thriving in this ecosystem world?
The book actually breaks that down, too. They looked at hundreds of companies, from huge names to scrappy startups, and it turns out there's some common strategies that successful contributors use. First, they're picky about the ecosystems they join. They look for those that are poised for success with a strong track record and a clear vision for the future.
So doing your due diligence is critical. It's not just about jumping on any bandwagon. What else makes a difference?
Once they're in smart contributors, define their level of engagement. How much are they willing to invest? How much control are they willing to give up? How much risk can they stomach? It's a balancing act.
It's like you want the benefits of the ecosystem, but you don't want to be totally at the mercy of the orchestrator either, right?
Exactly. And that's where standing out becomes so important. Contributors who bring something unique to the table, maybe it's cutting-edge, tech-specialized knowledge, or even just a stellar reputation, they're the ones who get noticed and can negotiate better terms.
It's like any collaboration. If you're just a cog in the machine, you're easily replaceable. But if you're the only one who can do what you do, you've got leverage.
Right. But here's the real challenge: avoiding commoditization. Contributors have to constantly innovate and evolve, or they risk becoming just another faceless supplier taking orders from the orchestrator.
Okay, now that's scary. To pour your heart and soul into building something amazing, only to have it become just another commodity. Have there been any real-world cautionary tales on this front?
Plenty, unfortunately. The book talks about Shazam, the sound recognition app. They had this brilliant algorithm way ahead of its time. But then smartphones become ubiquitous. Apple integrates similar functionality into Siri, and suddenly Shazam's fighting to stay relevant.
Ouch, talk about a wake-up call. So contributors need to be agile, strategic, and always thinking a few steps ahead. What's the final piece of the puzzle when it comes to their strategy?
Knowing when to exit. Sometimes an ecosystem just isn't working anymore. Maybe the orchestrator is becoming too dominant, the market is shifting, or the contributor has simply outgrown the ecosystem. Successful contributors know when it's time to move on and seize new opportunities.
It's like pruning a garden. Sometimes you have to cut away dead branches to allow for new growth.
Exactly. And that applies to entire ecosystems, too. The book talks about how these things are constantly evolving, merging, splitting, even dying off. It's a dynamic process, and contributors have to adapt.
Wow, so it's a wild ride.
Yeah.
So far, we've mostly focused on the business implications.
Yeah.
But this book touches on something much bigger, using ecosystems to tackle societal challenges. I'd love to dig into that a bit.
Yes. And this is where the concept of public-private ecosystems comes into play. Think about things like climate change, poverty, even access to healthcare. These are complex systemic issues that need governments, businesses, even individuals all working together.
That sounds incredibly ambitious. But are there any real-world examples of these public-private ecosystems making a difference?
Absolutely. The book highlights the Rwandan government's Smart and Kunganir system, or SNS. It started as a way to connect farmers with subsidized agricultural inputs like seeds and fertilizer, but it quickly grew into something much bigger.
Okay, so it started small, but then what? How did it evolve?
It became this broader platform that brought in seed companies, fertilizer suppliers, even banks. It's a fantastic example of how an ecosystem can adapt and grow to address new challenges.
So they started with one specific problem and ended up tackling the whole system. What are some of the key results they've seen?
The SNS is now addressing things like food security, financial inclusion, and even climate resilience in the agricultural sector. They've seen increased crop yields, improved access to markets for farmers, and a more resilient food system overall.
That's incredibly inspiring. It shows that ecosystems can be about so much more than just profit. They can be a real force for positive change.
Exactly. And the book argues that this is where ecosystems might have their greatest impact. By breaking down those silos and encouraging collaboration, we can start to tackle problems that have felt impossible to solve.
Okay, so we've gone from e-readers and ride-sharing apps to tackling global challenges. It's clear that business ecosystems are more than just a buzzword. They're a fundamental shift in how we think about creating value and solving problems, right?
Absolutely. And this book doesn't just stop at theory. It offers practical advice for anyone looking to build or participate in ecosystems.
Which is great because I'm sure, like me, our listeners are ready to move beyond theory and into action. What kind of practical advice does the book offer?
It really digs into the nitty-gritty of designing and managing ecosystems, from defining a crystal clear purpose to establishing that all-important governance model. It even gets into the technical weeds of data sharing and security, which are obviously non-negotiable in this day and age.
So it sounds like a valuable resource for anyone serious about building an ecosystem. But let's be real, building something like this from scratch feels kind of daunting.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most important first step?
The book is crystal clear on this point. It all starts with a well-defined problem statement. You absolutely have to identify a real pain point, something worth solving, something that justifies the complexity of an ecosystem. And it can't just be any problem. It has to be something that none of the players can solve on their own.
So it's got to be a problem that's big enough to matter, but also one that demands collaboration.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Once you've got that nailed down, you can start identifying potential partners, figuring out who does what, and establishing the rules of the game.
So it's a bit like putting together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
You need all the right pieces, and they have to fit together just so. But even with the best intentions, things can go sideways.
Yeah.
What are some common traps that ecosystem builders should try to avoid?
The book calls out a few classic mistakes, like trying to control everything that's a recipe for disaster in a collaborative model. And then there's failing to incentivize partners or underestimating the importance of clear communication and building that solid foundation of trust.
It strikes me that building a successful ecosystem is as much about the human element as it is about the business strategy.
100%. And you've got to be adaptable. Ecosystems are constantly changing, so you need to be ready to adjust your strategy, your governance, even your partnerships as the landscape shifts.
Wow. So it's dynamic, challenging, and maybe a little bit terrifying, but also incredibly exciting. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've busted myths, explored winning strategies, and even peeked into the world of ecosystems tackling massive societal issues. But I get the feeling this book is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, absolutely. We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully our listeners are walking away with a solid understanding of this fascinating world and maybe even feeling inspired to explore further.
For sure. And as a final thought, I think it's important to remember that business ecosystems aren't just some fleeting trend. They represent a fundamental shift in how we think about value creation and problem solving in a world that's more interconnected than ever.
Couldn't agree more. We're moving away from that old school model of cutthroat competition and toward a world of collaboration, co-creation, and shared success.
Exactly. It's less about winning and more about winning together.
And that begs the question, what opportunities for collaboration exist in your world, listener? What impossible problem could you help solve by joining or building an ecosystem?
It's a question worth pondering. So as you go about your week, keep that ecosystem lens handy. Be on the lookout for those unexpected connections, those opportunities to collaborate, those chances to be a part of something bigger than yourself. Because in this interconnected world, we're all part of the ecosystem.
Well said. This deep dive has explored the what, the why, and the how of business ecosystems. But ultimately, it's the what if that truly captivates.
What if we could harness this power to create a better, more sustainable, more equitable future? Now that's a question worth exploring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep diving deep.